Okay, right, Ben, thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to read a little bit of your bio to everyone. Now Ben is here. Ben is the head of client solutions for Centres and leads the business function responsible for overseeing Centres client partnerships. An experienced psychologist, he brings a strong background in performance psychology across both high performance sport and organisational contexts. So we won't delay too much further. Ben, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And apologies everyone that joined the webinar for the technical difficulties. A circular link that felt like I was in a roundabout and just couldn't get out. So nonetheless, we're all here and looking forward to jumping into this topic. Before we start, I do just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognise their connections to land, waters and community. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We do this because we value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' history, culture and knowledge as well. In terms of Centres, for those that aren't familiar with Centres, we are a management consulting company in the area of safety culture, and as we'll touch on today, that applies to physical, psychological and social safety as well. Worked with more than 400 organisations, been around 20 years this month actually, and range different organisations from mining through to healthcare and everything in between, and from Australia over to Canada, and again everything in between as well. Part of why we do what we do is really to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better, and where all of us at Centres get really energised by the work we do is where we can support organisations to really create thriving cultures. And as we'll touch on today, the psychosocial safety space really creates an opportunity for us to support organisations to do that as well. By means of an agenda, there's 4 areas that we want to touch on here as well. And we'll touch on the invisible nature of psychological injuries to a bit as well. Likewise, we'll then jump into what we call positive psychological safety, and in particular, the opportunity that this presents for organisations as well. Then we're going to touch on what does it look like to empower your leaders. This topic in itself, we could have a 50-hour webinar on just about, but we're going to touch on some of the key opportunities that organisations need to start looking at in empowering your leaders, and particularly in the psychosocial landscape. Empowering your leaders is such a critical part of it because of the nuances and the dynamic nature of what psychosocial safety looks like. And then we'll look at what positive safety integration looks like. So what does it look like for an organisation to do this well, and not just be seen to be doing something? What does it look like for an organisation to do this well? But interested to hear, we're now sort of a few months on from, and I'm making a presumption the slides are following me on here, and we've come to a poll here. Is particularly interested. We're now in July. April is when the new legislative requirements came out. Interested to hear how have people responded. How have your organisations responded? I suspect that there's been some responses, certainly some awareness and interest, given your attendance at today's webinar. But there's 4 options here. Be interested in your thoughts around. We don't know where to start, or we've only just started. We have done or are doing some risk assessments, but from that data or from that insight, we're not really sure where to go. And likewise, we're not sure, or option 3, we're not sure how to move beyond this compliance activity, which we're seeing a lot from organisations. And likewise, as a 4th option, we've been here for quite a while. We've only had to make minor tweaks, but we've been preparing for these legislative requirements for quite a while as well. So I'll give you a moment just to respond to that poll, and then we'll be interested in the insights.
Okay, I think we've got most of the responses now, so just put that up. So,
I can't see it.
Cassie, do you want to?
Yeah, no, go for it, Sarah.
Okay, so 38% have said we don't know where to start. We've only just started, and 45% we have done and are doing the risk assessment, but not sure where to go from here. 10% we are not sure how to move beyond this, beyond a compliance activity, and just 7% we have always been solid here and will only need to make minor tweaks.
Wonderful. So it looks like we've quite, responses sort of across most categories there. It's interesting. We see a lot of organisations, certainly talking to a lot of organisations that sit in the middle two, in particular. So we've done risk assessments, or we're trying to move beyond a compliance approach, but we're also seeing a lot of organisations really just not knowing where to start. And the data certainly captures that here as well, where organisations going, we know we need to do something, but we just don't know where to start. How do we start doing this, and how do we start to make sure that we're doing it well and we're doing it right and not get it wrong as well. I think those certainly for in the first two responses, you're certainly not alone. And I think the best part of your journey so far is you're acknowledging that, okay, we know we need to do something, but we're not sure where to start, and you're exploring webinars like this to start to look at, okay, well, where do we start as well. Thank you for taking the time to complete that as well. So then we want to jump into the invisible injury, and this is certainly a terminology that's starting to get a little bit more traction when we talk about psychological injuries. Interestingly, around psychological injuries, is the OHS Act has always made reference to both psychological and physical injuries, and a workplace's obligation to eliminate or minimise these risks to their workforce. However, what we've seen, and I'm sure most people here have experienced, is organisations have tended to focus more on the physical safety until recently, largely due to the invisible nature or often hidden nature of those psychological and social risks as well. Much easier to see a physical injury than what it might look like for a psychological injury. And certainly, they differ in a number of ways with respect to symptoms, onset, diagnosis, treatment, impact, and cost as well. Likewise, there's a lot more complexities around psychological injuries compared to what physical injuries might be as well. Likewise, and I think probably the biggest differentiator, and we'll touch on this in a moment, is the experience of psychosocial hazards, and likewise the risk that follows those is very different for individuals. And so how people experience perhaps the impact of those can also be different. So as an example, if someone's working from a height, as an example, and they're working from a height of 10 metres, we know obviously that hazard's very, very clear. We know the risk of that hazard, and understanding that, we know that if someone's to fall from a height of 10 metres, we know that the consequence of that is going to be always negative. We know that there's going to be a physical consequence there, and that consequence is going to largely be immediate, and it's going to be pretty much the same for everyone. And whether that's certainly a serious injury or fatality, but likewise whether it's sort of sprains and the like, broken bones and those sorts of things as well. Psychological injuries or psychosocial injuries are a little bit more complex in that someone exposed to a psychosocial risk, the impact or the consequence of the exposure to that risk is different for each individual. For some individuals, it might not be a negative thing, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. Likewise, as well, is it may not always happen as exposure to that psychosocial risk as well. And the other part as well is the consequence or the outcomes or the onset of symptoms may not be immediate as well. It might be years down the track where we start to see the impact of that. So it's often this hidden outcome that we can see, or hidden nature of these psychological and social risks, not just the presence of them, but also the outcome from them as well. I think what this has largely created over the last little while, and this is why we think that the legislative requirements are quite a good step in the right direction, is that often due to the invisible or hidden nature of those mental health conditions, those injuries, those psychological injuries, the stigma surrounding them, and leaders and organisations are reluctant to intervene. that's where we've seen organisations focus more so on the physical risks and the injuries in some areas at the expense of what's quite an escalating area in different communities and workplaces as well around the invisible injury, which we'll touch on just now. So to build upon that in a little bit more detail, we know that psychological health conditions are the fastest rising cause of disability in Australia. For instance, suicide is the most common cause of death for people aged between 15 and 44, and that's really worrying in itself. Claims for mental health workers' compensation are increasing around 15 times faster than physical injury claims. It's around about 1.8 billion paid out by compensation agencies in 2018. That's expected to rise and is rising quite considerably as well. There's a report recently by PwC actually that the cost of untreated mental health problems is predicted to rise to about 18.6 billion by 2025. So there's a huge cost in these areas, both financially but likewise for people themselves as well. Often those that experiencing mental health claims or undergoing mental health claims, the cost is 4 times on average more than physical claims, and likewise that there's often double the time off as well for someone that's experiencing a mental health episode or disorder as a result of workplace stress, as an example, compared to a sprained ankle as an example, just to compare 2 examples there. Likewise, there's a lot of follow-on effects from that as well, and one of the things that we know is that often those psychological challenges can exacerbate physical injuries in themselves as well. Interesting that the Black Dog Institute, actually, which I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with as well, that they found that untreated mental health conditions untreated in the workplace can lead to 30% reduction in work performance, a 70% increase in accidents, and a 60% increase in lost work days as well. We actually, through our research with quite a large sample of different organisations, we've actually found that work for about 2/3 of people, 66% of people, work has a negative or a neutral impact on their life outside of work. So what we mean by that is that for 2/3 of people, work is not having a positive impact on what life looks like outside of work, which that in itself is quite a worrying statistic as well. Some other opportunities here, and we look at going from compliance to culture here, and we look at the cost, and part of why we present this data and different reports and different forums are providing this data is, and probably just a side invitation to yourselves, is as you make the business case for change to different executives, to different leaders, to boards, etc., different people within those forums are going to be motivated by different metrics or different insights as well. So you can see a few here that I'll touch on just briefly here. For example, the first one here is that the calculated cost of psychological injury in the workplace. It can be a good place to start in terms of creating that business case. And once we combine the cost of absenteeism, and organisations combine that with the cost of compensation claims, and actually there's a multiplier of between 1.5 to 3 by Safe Work Australia to include your indirect costs such as productivity, lost productivity, hiring and training, replacing workers, and likewise reduced morale. That cost can be quite a high cost as well. What we actually are inviting as organisations is, rather than it being a cost exercise purely, is actually to look at what's the return on investment, and again, different research around and different reports around that are showing that for every dollar invested into this space, there's a return of between $2.30 and $5.80, depending on what that investment tends to look like as well, directly to the bottom line. So not only is this the right thing to do, this is really an opportunity for organisations in terms of doing good business as well. I touched on before the risk of injury and exacerbated severity and duration of recovery for physical safety as well, and those are experiencing a physical injury, and likewise a psychological injury, that's exacerbated to quite a degree also as well. At an organisational level, the cost of turnover due to poor mental health is really high and estimated to be about $1.5 billion per year in Australia. And interestingly, 72% of employees who rate their workplace as having a poor or worse psychosocial safety climate are looking for new jobs, compared to 9% of those that rate their workplace as having an excellent psychosocial safety climate. So the impact of turnover often isn't realised by a lot of organisations. And I know an organisation I was working with just last week is they've gone through some challenges which has impacted what psychosocial safety looks like for their people, and they've gone from being an employer of choice over a longer period than just the last few months, an employer of choice, to now their turnover is they're losing quite a few people over the last few months as well. The other part of this, and this sort of touches it, is there's, all of these things start to combine in terms of, what lost revenue looks like, decreased market value, increased costs, retention rates, recruitment costs. There's a lot of invisible injury here. There's a lot of hidden costs within that as well. All of these things are really interesting to take into account and certainly help build a business case. If not the legislative requirements are driving that, really, and this is the conversation that we're inviting with a lot of our clients, is that there's a big miss here that organisations are probably not taking into account, and we're really inviting organisations to look through this lens when they're looking at the legislative requirements and the cost and the like there as well. Is that organisations actually have an opportunity to see these regulations as an opportunity to enable your organisation, is rather than just an exercise in compliance, is to actually use this to really drive cultural change, and to make the organisation more effective in how it engages, with safety systems and procedures and processes in place, but to really create a thriving culture rather than just a compliant culture. And that's certainly what we're inviting organisations to do. And organisations can do a range of different box tick exercises, which I've got sort of a few different schools of thoughts on that. Where the opportunity is for organisations to go, hey, look, we are missing the mark in terms of the legislative requirements, and we need to do a lot in this space. Let's really make sure we do this well, and really see this as an opportunity to create a thriving culture. And certainly I'm motivated by working with organisations that want to do that just as much as well. I imagine most of you, and we jump into the new frontier in safety in terms of just having a look at this slide here, which I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with, and I'm sure many people are familiar with the code and psychosocial risks that can create poor health outcomes for your employees. Probably to recap here is that the psychosocial hazards are anything in the design or management of work that increases the risk of psychological harm. There's 14 hazards that relate to demands of role, organisational pressure or factors, likewise the social environment and interpersonal relationships as well. It's not necessarily an exhaustive list, as there are others, but these are the key hazards that have been identified as well. What we do find, and probably worth calling out at this point, is we do find that a lot of organisations tend to use these terms interchangeably with respect to psychosocial hazards and psychosocial risks. They are distinct in terms of their potential to cause harm. So, as an example, psychosocial hazards, and you can see the definition there, are the sources of potential harm, whereas psychosocial risks is the probability that harm will occur as a result of exposure to those risks. So to put that in a variant, actually, a conversation we're in yesterday internally actually is to put this in a simplistic terminology. The hazard is a fire. The risk is how close you are to that fire and the likelihood of getting burnt and mechanism in place to prevent that, and the consequences of that as well. Put that in a psychosocial context, is a hazard might be unreasonable workloads and excessive work hours. But looking at that around the risk is, well, what's the risk of experiencing fatigue, burnout, etc., which then relates in a psychological injury, whether that be physical symptoms, or whether that be psychological symptoms such as depression or anxiety as well. Probably interested to understand, and these are the 14 key ones, and different other hazards will sit in amongst these categories as well. But probably interested to explore of which of these key ones in particular have organisations, or have your organisations, which are the hazards that seem the most, perhaps the most challenging or most daunting to address at the moment.
Okay, I put the poll up so people can see that. Okay.
All right. So which ones are? Yeah, go.
Yeah, I'll do that now. All right. So high work demands, that's 64% of the people polled selected that option. Low levels of job control, 19%. Lack of role clarity, 19% too. Inadequate leader support, 47%. Poor workplace relationships, 11%. Inappropriate or unreasonable behaviour, 19%. And poor change management, 28%. So there you go.
Yeah, okay. We're talking about combining platforms here. Cassie's just sending this through to me on Microsoft Teams as well. So we'll probably get Google Meetings happening somewhere in the mix here as well soon. But interesting to see the spread, and not surprised at all by high work demands, inadequate leader support, and even poor change management in there, is particularly because the leader support one in particular, and we'll touch on in a moment, is such an opportunity for organisations to address this area as well. Wonderful. Look, as I touched on before, these regulations really bring about a new approach for how organisations need to define and manage safety. What we're inviting organisations to look at is not to treat these separately, is to go, we're going to manage physical safety or physical risk, and then we're going to manage psychosocial risk, is to actually look at what does a holistic view look like with respect to incorporating these three areas. So in terms of redefining safety here, is looking at the physical safety, so the protection of employees from physical hazards, such as hazardous materials, illness or dangerous machinery, psychological experience for people in terms of the state of feeling comfortable enough to express one's opinions, thoughts and ideas without fear of judgment or retribution, and trust certainly sits in here as well. And then the social protection of employees from social hazards such as bullying, harassment, discrimination and other forms of abuse as well. What we call the combination of these things is positive safety, and it's moving safety beyond a narrow focus on the absence of harm to a proactive approach to promote wellbeing and productivity in the workplace. What we've seen in legislation has helped drive this a little bit, is we've seen for quite a while in different industries, is the focus is on physical safety, which was, a lot of transformations happened in that space. And then we see organisations started to look more so, and again, the Work Health Safety Acts is, the combination of physical and psychological safety, and start to combine those two. The recent legislations have really helped articulate, and psychosocial is not new, it's been around for quite a while, but it helped articulate, I think, for organisations that all three need to be considered. And now we're seeing organisations look at the combination, the integration of physical, psychological and social safety in this lens as well. And really, how can an organisation can support employees to be the best version of themselves and to thrive, creating an environment where people can be physically, psychologically and emotionally or socially safe to that degree as well. So the invitation here, and as we'll touch on, is as part of your strategies, the interventions you're looking at, what does it look like to do so across all three? And we're having a lot of conversations with organisations at the moment of looking at what does it, what does our strategy around physical safety look like? And then what does our strategy around psychosocial safety look like, and how we understand the cultures of those things as well is we would actually invite is don't just look at your psychological culture, look at your safety culture as a whole and how that touches on physical, psychological and social as well. If organisations want to understand, what the experience of safety is like for people, you've got to look from a cultural point of view at all three, because they need to be addressed in an integrated way as well. Where we can incorporate these three elements to a holistic view of workplace safety, we can start to foster cultures of trust, resilience, collaboration, and inclusiveness, and creates a more sustainable success with respect to safety culture for the organisation as a whole, rather than seeing the new regulations as a burden on top of what we're already doing with our health and safety system. So, to my earlier point, a lot of organisations, their health and safety systems are very much anchored towards physical safety, and rather than just going, we'll just throw psychological on top of that, actually let's take the opportunity to integrate them and look at what it looks like to improve upon them all, rather than just adding psychosocial on top of what we're already doing in the physical space as well. That is where organisations are going to have the most success in this area as well. On the flip side, where those aren't integrated, organisations aren't best placed in terms of preventing psychological injury, reducing workers' compensation, likewise absenteeism, turnover, improving the reputation is organisations risk this very sort of piecemeal approach to addressing safety, rather than taking this holistic view of what health and safety looks like across the organisation. This is likewise where we start to get into conversations around, well, who owns safety? The safety department traditionally has, but now HR is now going to have a greater impact in this area. Legal and risk are the likewise as well. And, much like the model describes, but in a different way, the integration of those teams and how they're working to meet regulations, but likewise integrate these three areas is the real opportunity for organisations. And I'm excited to see organisations integrate these three into their strategy rather than treating them separately or in different manners as well. So again, I'm interested in people's thoughts here. Is what are your current interventions primarily targeting? Are they targeting process and policies and risk assessments? Are they targeting environment, job design, resourcing, team member capability, capacity, leadership capability and capacity, or are they targeting all of the above? What does that integration look like across all of those areas as well?
Thanks, Ben. We've got that running. I realise you can't see anything, and it's easy for me to forget that. Okay, just a few more seconds. Thanks, guys. Okay, so where are your current interventions primarily targeting? 57% process and policies and risk assessments. Environment, job design, resourcing, just 4%. Team member capacity and capability, 7%. Leadership capability and capacity, 4%. All of the above, 29%. Thanks, Ben.
Wonderful. So interesting to see, the focus, certainly some with all of the above, but quite a strong focus on process policies and risk assessments. And certainly that's a risk assessment place is a good place to start in terms of understanding, well, we need to understand what's going on in order to work out, what we're going to target or where we're going to target and what needs to be, although everything that can be done, what are those critical areas that we need to start with focusing as well. What's interesting, and we'll jump onto the next slide here, where you can see our safety culture model. So one other comment I'll make on that is not a lot of focus as yet on what that leadership capability and capacity looks like as well. What's interesting around that space, and certainly the legislation sort of starts to explore this as well, is that executive support commitment, their demonstration for what a psychosocial safety system is called out as best practice. So in short, leaders need to be playing a critical role in how best we set our safety culture or safety up for success within our organisations. And even, from the ISO guidelines, I'm looking at a direct quote here, is that success of psychosocial risk management depends on commitment from all levels and function of the organisation, especially from top management. So this model here is what this model alludes to is, if we're trying to create a physically, psychologically and socially safe workplace where people can be well, healthy and thrive, or create a positive safety culture, to use that terminology, these are the four things that an organisation needs to be working in. These are the four areas that an organisation needs to be exploring. You can see some of this in what we just touched on in the previous poll here. Think of this model is a little bit like a four-legged chair, is that an organisation needs to be considering all four areas in order to set an organisation's safety culture up for success with respect to physical, psychological and social. So four-legged chair, much like operating in the same way, is that if you have got one of those legs that's not working quite right, there's a risk that the chair could fall over. If you've got two of those legs that's not a bit wobbly, or certainly one that's really loose, your likelihood that the chair is going to fall over is much higher. Same with this model here, is that we need to invest appropriately and rightfully across leadership, person practices and the environment components in order to have a physically, psychologically and socially safe workplace. Where we see organisations tend to go is they go heavily in the environment and the practices area. We can see a little bit that in the poll, largely, and it's fair enough in some degree, as they're easier. They're easier to target in those areas. Shifting the way people think or engage with their work, likewise shifting the way that leaders lead or trying to get leaders to do more of one thing or less of another thing. It's a more complex thing to target. However, we know that those things are critically important to drive the sort of change in workplace culture that we want to try and generate as well. And often when we see incidents play out in the workplace, whether they be physical incidents, psychological incidents, or certainly the combination of the two, is most of the time there's been something in the person or the leadership component, often the leadership component, that has fallen down. So that leg of the chair has become wobbly, and that's been one of the contributing factors to that incident occurring as well. The psychosocial space in particular is very dynamic, it's very complex, it requires a leader to be able to pick up on the nuances that their team members are experiencing and how they change from day to day, different to what physical risks or physical safety might look like, where, and I shared earlier, that the consequences of falling off working from 10-metre height is going to be the same for everyone, whatever height that might be. Whereas for in a psychosocial context, it's going to be different for different individuals. So leadership and at all levels need the capability to lead a psychosocially safe workplace, but within that, they also need to be able to pick up on how to do that differently for different team members just as much as well. Talking to a slightly different construct in terms of psychological safety, but is one of the things that I think really jumps out in this space here, is that and from Amy Edmondson, which I'm sure many people have heard of, is not surprisingly the most important influence on psychological safety is the nearest boss. And to probably extend that just slightly, the biggest influence on psychosocial safety is the nearest leader. And certainly our research has found that as well, is we look at safety leadership, and safety leadership is a little bit different to what leadership looks like more generally, where you have a combination of both transactional and transformational leadership skills. And on the left-hand side, you see the model that we use to help understand and assess a leader's competencies across the skills that are needed to be an effective safety leader. And what we find is that the effectiveness in the safety leader has the biggest influence across all of those different dimensions on wellbeing climate. And the strength of that relationship is very strong, actually, compared to what that might look like around communication, how areas are managed, what it looks like in terms of contractor safety relationships, team safety climate. The wellbeing climate is very, very heavily influenced by a leader's direct role as well. Research actually finds that it's about half, about 50% of the variance in safety climate scores is driven by leadership. So the way leaders prioritise, the way they communicate about safety in the workplace, the level of trust employees have in leaders, and the extent to which leaders support wellbeing is the biggest determinant of an employee's mental health, much more so than their work demands, their job control, the social support that might be in place as well. I can't emphasise this enough, and I could go on about it till I'm blue in the face. Leadership is such a critical capability in how organisations are going to create a thriving, psychosocially safe workplace as well. They have the ability, and to put it very bluntly, to make or break it in many regards also. Where the opportunity exists here is you're going to likely find a lot of frames that exist by leaders, and the opportunity is how we go about shifting those frames. The challenge that a lot of stakeholders such as yourselves are likely to find, I'm sure you already have as well, is that from a physical safety point of view, most leaders can see that putting the right protections in place, the right support, the right resources, tools, the right leadership support in place is needed for physical risks. We spoke earlier on around the invisible nature of some of the psychological risks. That's where we're seeing more leaders perhaps have some objections around this space, and certainly some of the older school leaders and somewhat ironically / frustratingly is often the leaders that need to shift their leadership capability are the ones that have the most objections to this space. And even a leader I was talking to recently that, throwing out frames like, people are paid to do a job, they just need to do a job. That's all they should expect from their workplace. And you sort of bow your head a little bit in sort of frustration to go, we've advanced so much beyond that to some of those very old styles of thinking about a workplace. There's much more than an organisation needs, and now legislatively needs to provide for their people as well. So whilst an organisation or the regulations require an organisation to start with a systemic approach to how they eliminate or reduce risk, and certainly that's what we would invite. The onus, there's a large onus on leaders to actually identify, intervene and address risks in a clear way, and requires a big shift in a leader's mindset, their capacity and their capability to be able to do so as well. So I spoke earlier on before around leaders needing to really be able to adapt to their individuals, is the way they will create a psychosocially safe workplace for their team members. They could have 2 direct reports. They might need to approach those 2 direct reports differently in how they create a psychosocially safe workplace. We go back to some of the hazards listed early on before as an example, and one of those, let's take one of the hazards as an example. Let's take isolated work or remote or isolated work. You can have 2 team members, and one person actually finds isolated work or remote work to be quite a positive experience for them and actually builds their well-being and health. Likewise, you can find someone else, another direct report, who actually finds that really challenging, and that creates quite an stressful experience for them at work. You can't necessarily, you can to a degree, but a systematic approach or a process or a policy approach is not going to fully address that. The onus is very much on the leader to be able to pick up on how exposure to that hazard is influencing those 2 direct team members differently. You can imagine what this looks like as you start to build that out to more people and exposure to more risks, more hazards as well. One of the things we want to offer, and there's different tools and there's different frameworks around here, is leaders don't necessarily need to have all the answers, but they need to have the capability and some of the tools. And there'll be leaders that say, "Oh, this isn't my job." I would actually probably invite that if you accept the role or the responsibility of a leader, absolutely, this is also your responsibility. This is now part of, and now legislatively part of, your role as a leader as well. Is some questions that were pulled together here to help leaders have these conversations with people and to check in. And again, leaders don't need to know all the answers, but they need to be able to recognise that something's not quite right here, or this person certainly isn't thriving, perhaps in some instances not surviving, to borrow that language. We need to do something differently in creating a better, positive safety culture, perhaps generally, but certainly for this individual here, and manage those psychosocial risks. So there's different tools and there's different frameworks around. There's a resource you can access from our website here as well. These 6 questions really we've put together to help leaders have some of these really daunting and uncomfortable conversations, and to get to the bottom of this without the bottom of what might be happening, without conducting a full risk assessment of the 14 different psychosocial hazards as well. They also tap into the requirements of the regs to take a trauma-informed approach to understanding a person's previous experience or exposure to these risks, and the interplay of personal factors outside of work as well, which is an important consideration also. So the first question there is around, how do you feel about your job lately? Is there anything happening at work that could be, causing stress or creating a stressful experience? Are there any issues going on in your personal life that could be influencing how you feel, or the interplay between personal and work life as well? Have you been through anything tough recently or in the past that might be making it harder for you to cope now? Or do you have enough support from co-workers, from yourself, other leaders if something comes up, or for the current challenge? Are there any safety concerns in the workplace that need to be addressed? And highlighting that both physical or psychosocial concerns in the workplace as well. What these questions invite is a deeper conversation that empowers leaders to engage in these conversations and have that more holistic approach rather than just a psychosocial. It's supporting that psychosocial risk management system without it being have you spoke to the EAP, that deference, which that response just in itself can actually create some stress as well in some contexts. So it's equipping leaders with the skills to have the conversation, and importantly, in a key part to stress to your leaders, is recognising there's the part where you support, but likewise there's the part where you recognise that, okay, I actually need to now refer to or bring in, the support of HR, and then likewise, EAP providers, psychologists, medical professionals in that domain as well. That leaders don't have to have all the answers; they just need to be there to help people be able to verbalise and then recognise that they're going through a challenging time. And start the support that's needed and appropriate from that point as well. The next one is I want to touch on just before we do finish up is I've touched on the critical role that leaders play in building that capability as well. Leadership programs will do this to an extent. Coaching is going to be really supportive in that, because leaders are going to be equipped with these tools and resources for how they might prompt conversation, but how do they apply that to the nuances, to different team members, to different contexts, under stress, through periods of high demand. Coming back to my earlier point, leaders can be the thing that makes or breaks that. And so really developing your leadership capability to create a psychosocially safe workplace is going to be absolutely critical, as well as doing more of that systematic change as well. Likewise, individual change as well. Leaders create that environment, and seeing organisations probably, they'll roll out wellbeing programs or resilience programs, and they'll do that once a year. You do those things more frequently, but just doing those things is akin to taking a goldfish out of a fish tank, giving it a polish, and then throwing it back into the dirty fish tank water. Is you've got to actually shift the environment that people are operating within, leaders have a huge impact on what that looks like as well. Moving more to, okay, well, what does that systemic change look like as well is I'm sure a lot of you, and going back to one of the earlier polls before, is there's a lot of opportunities in this space, and I'm sure what's needed can be a little bit daunting for some people as well. From our experience, and the psychosocial space is not a new space, it's just been probably just articulated in a different way, and certainly through legislations. From our experience, change is often created from the inside out, and that's looking at what is an organisation currently doing well with their existing culture, their existing systems, processes, leadership as well, and looking at how do we build upon that, but then likewise, what might be the opportunities that we need to address as well, and not trying to do everything at once, certainly, but looking at where are those things that are going to have the most impact on creating the sort of thriving, positive safety culture that we want to as well. So the starting place is gather data. That might be starting with internal HR, safety, engagement data. Likewise, it might be working with a provider. There's different surveys around, or certainly culture surveys as well, climate surveys also, to understand, well, what's the current state of play? What are our strengths that we can build upon, but what are those opportunities that we might need to address as well? And then looking at how you might benchmark yourself. So in this space, internal benchmarking is often more useful or valuable, certainly as a starting point, than external benchmarking of that data. We often find organisations go, how do we compare to other organisations? Yeah, that's helpful data. You actually want to compare different parts of your organisation, because that shows, okay, this business unit is really struggling with X, Y, Z, or they're being exposed to this hazard quite regularly. We need to do something differently in that space. It can get that sort of insight can get a little bit lost in external benchmarking. Likewise, then looking at a solution and using that data to help formulate a strategy, a solution that targets the critical parts of your organisations, the areas that need most addressing. Don't focus, as I mentioned before, just on the person within the system and go, we'll just roll out a resilience program, or the bowl of fruits or gym memberships. Yeah, those things are all well and good. But they can be certainly there can be a focus there on your tertiary interventions, but also looking at your primary and secondary interventions as well, and certainly from a systematic or a holistic lens also. Part of this is looking at what's achievable. There's a number of strategy workshops I've delivered where we're going to do these 24 things and we're going to get 20 of them done in Q1. It's not achievable, and then it starts to actually disengage the organisation from that change as well. So only commit to what can actually be done and focus on what those actions need to be. What's going to have the most value in terms of creating that positive safety culture as well. There's the combination of the quick wins, but likewise the bigger projects is not necessarily those things that they might be nice to have, or they're it's a lot of expended energy for not much value necessarily at this point in time anyway as well. The other part to that is then looking at what do we want to add? What do we want to add? But critically, what do we want to improve upon? And we spoke before around the integration of physical, psychological, and social is not just going, look, we're going to add this, or we're going to add this, and we're going to add that on top of what we already do. What are we doing well that we can expand upon into that full, three-dimensional approach to safety? If we're managing, this element of how we do physical safety really well, okay, well, how can we broaden that to how we actually manage psychosocial safety as well? If that works well for our organisation also. That reflection on what's in its human nature, that reflection on what's actually working well is a critical consideration, just as much also. The other part to this is it's not a set and forget. The culture is a dynamic thing. Positive safety culture is a dynamic thing. Psychosocial spaces, physical safety is the combination, integration of those things is a dynamic space, and so you need to keep your finger on the pulse. What's the scoreboard that we're looking at that gives us an insight, and not just the lag metrics, but the lead metrics in terms of where our focus is. What are the things we need to be doing more of, less of, tweak? How are we going with our interventions? Are they hitting the mark? as well. And the big part in this is celebrating the wins along the way, and recognising the work that might still need to be done as well. From this process is showing progress is the critical part, so that the commitments that you make is likewise all the organisational team members need to see that actually making traction, and recognising that yes, there's still other areas that need to be done, but here's where we're making traction. Otherwise, those familiar with Noster model of complex change is that where people don't see the change, they quickly start to disengage with what that looks like. And this psychosocial space is such a critical space that we've got to take the time to invest to make sure that we do get that right. One of the things I will call out just before we do wrap up as well is gathering the data and having some insight, and that can be a combination of climate or cultural surveys, risk assessment tools, etc., other data sources as well. It's not so much about the individual data sources as it is the narrative or story between those data sources. Is using that data to help form a strategy is really critical. It's that piece that is the difference between those organisations that want to have an impact versus those that want to be seen just to be doing something. Really easy to put something in place to make it look like you're doing something. It's the data process and making sure that there's an evidence-based approach to what you're doing is the critical part to making sure that you're actually creating long-term and sustainable change in this space as well. So wrapping up, otherwise I'll keep going and you'll have to cancel your dinner plans. We've touched on a few things. One is looking at how do we shift range and increase awareness around what this psychosocial space is. One of our clients actually, I love the language that they use, where they've actually shifted away to now looking at how well do we understand how people experience work, and people are really engaged with that notion as well. And I think that's just a really good way to capture what psychosocial safety is. Leading by example and aligning expectations, we spoke about, leadership's role in that. Likewise, as stakeholders here, safety, HR, legal and risk, whoever it might be, what does it look like to lead by example, and particularly from the board and executive level? They play a critical role, as we touched on, in driving this space. And if you've got, trying to create an inclusive workplace, with appropriate behaviours as is part of this psychosocial landscape, if that's not being demonstrated by the board as an example, by executive, that's the starting place, because otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable, long and short of it. Building leadership capability and capacity, we spoke about, encouraging input and providing support. Is consulting with people is also really important, of what it looks like to create or mould what a psychosocial experience looks like for people in the workplace as well. The importance of consulting is really, really key throughout this also. Creating a psychologically safe workplace takes more than a policy or program. It takes a culture of respect, trust and accountability. This is just such a fabulous quote that really encompasses a dynamic space, but it's a really exciting space for organisations to really create some really thriving, safe, healthy, well workplaces where the organisation, but likewise the people, can get a lot out of the work they do, and importantly, see the number of people that are finding work positively impacts their well-being is increasing from the 1/3 that we spoke to earlier on before. For those that are interested, we are running a masterclass in psychosocial safety coming up, where we'll unpack a little bit of this, but likewise we'll unpack some things in some more detail, particularly around the role of leadership in creating a psychosocially safe workplace as well. But for me, look, thank you very much, everyone, for dialing in. Apologies about the technical challenges, but I'm glad we're all able to jump on the call here. I'm really energised. I'm fascinated by this space. It's such a wonderful opportunity with these legislative changes coming in. And certainly happy to jump on any calls or respond to any questions or messages that may come through to support people in their journey as well.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And thanks for coping with the rocky start, and also to all the audience that were very supportive with the little bit of a today. So we have a couple of questions, and by the way, the information was fantastic. Ben. Braid has asked Ben and team, we've had a few staff leave and I have a challenge getting our MD to even understand psychosocial issues. We have those staff return, but it's probably due to other alternatives being worse in New Zealand. Ben, did you hear that?
Sorry, did I put myself on mute? Yeah, I can see the comment there as well. Probably, yeah, I think getting executives, and there's another question there around the senior team don't want to ask the question, is what we're seeing a lot of organisations ask for, and what we're providing a lot of is board sessions, which is around getting them to understand their responsibilities and roles in this, and I think particularly at a board level, if there is a serious incident in the psychological space, they're actually going to be the ones held to account in a large part as well. So it's probably helping them understand that this is not, as we hear many boards, MDs, senior leadership teams, leaders of all levels articulate, that this psychology is the soft and fluffy stuff. Is we actually need to see these legislative requirements are the right thing and a step in the right direction, and these are the requirements and what it looks like. But likewise, these are the impacts of it as well. And I think looking to some of the cost data, looking at some of the return on investment data, but likewise looking at the presence of injury and incidents for people as well across workplaces. Coming back to an earlier point, is looking at what different data is going to resonate with different members of a leadership team or with a board as well is key. Remembering that those leadership teams, boards, executive groups, they're made up of people as well, much like people across a workforce may have sort of different views on these things. It's also aligning that group on what needs to be done, or what the challenge is in front of them also as well. Is often they're not, and for a few different reasons, they're not aware of actually how big a challenge this might be for their organisation.
Sue also asked, which you may have answered, what do you do when the senior team do not want to ask the question?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. Whether it's the question around the questions I went through for a leader, a psychosocial check-in, or whether it's more around just entertaining the psychosocial space.
It was when you were doing the check-in questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question actually. I think part of it is understanding why people don't want to ask those questions. Often it's a confidence thing. It feels like a daunting task. Sometimes, probably more rarely, is it where they don't see the value in it. And then I think it's probably more coaching and support, whether that's driven by a external coach, or whether that's driven by HR or the safety team as well, to try and prompt and understand why a leader might not be engaging. That's something that it can work for some. We're coming back to different people resonate with different data, but it might be really understanding what's holding someone back as a leader from prompting those conversations. And we can be quick to go as leaders, not asking the question because we feel it's X, Y, Z and they're not being a leader properly. They, as much as their team members, may be also experiencing different challenges, and so taking the time to listen and hear what's holding someone back from doing that and how they can be supported through it. There's no reason that a leader can't go and check in with one of their team members with the support of another leader, if that's positioned right. That's a big part of it as well. So, and I'm even reflecting on a session around with the leadership group last week. Actually, is as an executive or as a stakeholder trying to facilitate this sort of culture, is taking the time to listen and understand what's holding someone back from that. So, if a leader is saying, I don't want to ask the question because I'm not going to get a helpful response, it's almost sort of coaching, exploring that with that leader to go, can you tell me what sort of influenced that, that thinking, or why you might feel that way, and they'll share and taking the time just to listen from that leader around what's holding them back.
Okay, thank you, Ben. There's not really any more questions, but there are a lot of comments and just for your feedback too. Some great information. This is regarding the webinar. Thanks, Ben, really informative. Thank you, that was brilliant from Keely. Thank you, Ben, very well presented. Great info from Ian. And Braid says, thanks, Ben. Yes, the data will be a good buy-in as a motivator. Rhonda, Rhonda says we need to be mindful that our leaders are also under a lot of pressure and their psychological health and safety is a consideration too. And Kevin says, great presentation, a long way to go here to achieve greatness. There's just one more anonymous question. We have to remember that psychosocial risks are relatively new in business. We will need to do a lot of work in this area. So we have gone a little bit over time, so we will need to wrap it up. But Ben, that was fantastic. I might have a chat with Cassie about getting some of the stats for the news too. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, just one comment I'll make is be comfortable as you start to push this more and more into, or position this more and more into your organisation with the executive board groups, is be comfortable rolling with the resistance in terms of how you do position it, and recognise it's going to take people different lengths of time to get on board with it. So be comfortable rolling with the resistance to start facilitating the change that you want to as well.
Yeah, that sounds totally
wonderful.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cassie, and thanks to all the audience for that lovely, warm support at the start with the issues. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.